The Alien franchise is cursed. Despite its cult status, films about the alien constantly seem to be on the verge of failure, as if under some kind of curse. How can you say that about a franchise that essentially stole an entire word? What's the first association that comes to mind when you hear the word alien?
Get away from her, you bitch!
I think the answer is obvious. Even today, the franchise jumps from great entries to absolute garbage. But why does that happen? Well, right now I'm going to talk about every film and series about Alien. Hello, this is 11 Slate and the ultimate history of Alien. To truly find the starting point of the Alien series, we need to look earlier than 1979, when the first film was released, and talk about John Carpenter. In 1974, the future cult director released his debut feature, the comedic science fiction film Dark Star. One of its writers was Dan O'Bannon, one of the creators of the legendary Monster. Carpenter's film included scenes with a strange, funny-looking alien made out of a beach ball. Inside it was Nick Castle, who would later play Michael Myers in Halloween. It was during the production of Dark Star that O'Bannon became obsessed with the idea of writing a film about humanity encountering a mysterious alien monster, only this time truly terrifying. Later, fate brought him together with Swiss artist Hans-Rudi Giger, famous for his incredibly realistic and disturbing artwork. At one point, Giger was even detained at an airport because officials believed his drawings were photographs depicting scenes of violence. The artist and the screenwriter were originally supposed to work on the incredibly ambitious adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune by the psychedelic master Alejandro Jodorowsky. But the project collapsed, and O'Bannon, armed with his promising new collaboration, sat down to write a script titled Star Beast. A second writer, Ronald Shusett, soon joined the project, and the core elements of the future masterpiece began to emerge. The one that would eventually launch a hugely profitable franchise. Space truckers responding to a distress signal. The remains of a mysterious alien civilization on a distant planetoid. A terrifying creature that begins killing the characters one by one. The first version of the script can now be found in comic book form. It differs from the final film in the causes of the characters' deaths, the design of the creature, and the absence of an android aboard the ship. In the future, the writers would often be accused of plagiarism, with people claiming they had stolen the idea from various earlier films. O'Bannon had a famous response to this. "I didn't steal Alien from anyone. I stole it from everybody." The idea of landing after receiving a distress signal was inspired by Forbidden Planet with a young Leslie Nielsen. The cold artificial intelligence called Mother clearly echoes HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Ordinary workers being killed by a mysterious creature already appeared in The Thing from Another World, which John Carpenter would later remake into the cult classic, The Thing starring Kurt Russell. I'll soon talk about every adaptation of The Thing in a big video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. You could spend a long time discussing why the first Alien worked so well despite its seemingly unoriginal ingredients. Of course, the excellent script, strong directing, convincing performances, and impressive production design all played a role. But I believe the main factor behind the film's success was Hans-Rudi Giger, who designed the appearance of the alien itself. The unique and unforgettable design of the central monster is the primary reason the film achieved worldwide recognition. If you compare it to other movie monsters of the 1970s, the difference is striking. And to understand just how effective the film was, pay attention to one simple fact. It claimed an entire world for itself, alien, a term that had previously referred to any extraterrestrial being. But now, when you hear it, you immediately think of the hostile xenomorph. That's the creature's official name. First, the terrifying tail-wielding monster with 2 mouths and acid for blood, and only after that all the other meanings. So the first version of the script was ready by the mid-1970s, but the studio, 20th Century Fox, which had shown interest in it, was in no hurry to start production. More precisely, the future film ended up in the hands of the Brandywine Production Company, which worked closely with Fox. The studio's reaction was roughly this: "Ugh, science fiction. Silly entertainment with rubber monsters and laser guns." Spending millions on such a project didn't sound very appealing. Then Star Wars exploded at the box office, pulling hundreds of millions out of audiences' pockets worldwide. Suddenly, every studio wanted to make something set in space. Even James Bond went to space. 20th Century Fox finally put the film into production. It was no longer called Star Beast, now it was simply Alien. The idea came to the writers when they realized the word was used constantly throughout the script. Why search for alternatives when the simplest, most universal, and most importantly unused title had been there all along? The studio hired a young director named Ridley Scott to helm the project. He had impressed audiences with his debut film, The Duelists, about a long rivalry between two French soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. Incidentally, that movie later became a major inspiration for another famous fantasy franchise, Highlander. In 1979, Alien finally arrived in theaters and became a massive box office success. At first, the studio agreed on a budget of just over $4 million, which was obviously not enough for Ridley Scott's ambitious vision. But after Giger presented his main concept art, and another brilliant artist, Jean Giraud, better known as Mobius, prepared detailed storyboards together with the director, the studio sensed that a masterpiece might be coming and doubled the budget. The premise is beautifully simple. A group of space truckers aboard the star freighter Nostromo are transporting a massive ore refinery back to Earth. Suddenly, they're awakened from hypersleep when the ship receives a signal from an uninhabited planetoid. According to their contract, they must investigate such transmissions.
Penalty of total forfeiture of shares. Money.
All right, we're going in.
Yeah, we're going in.
An alien organism ends up on board, and the film turns into the classic horror game of hide and seek in the empty corridors of the ship. But simplicity alone does not create success. Let's look at the specific directing and storytelling techniques that made Alien such an effective film and spawned dozens of imitators. Let's begin with the slogan, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Yes, it's a brilliant marketing line that describes the movie perfectly, but it's also the entire concept of Alien expressed in a single sentence. The film contains only 7 human characters, not counting the xenomorph itself. And the story begins with a long, almost excessively long introduction showing the vastness of space while the title slowly appears. Then we observe the spaceship move through its empty corridors and watch the crew of the Nostromo awaken, a tiny, insignificant group when compared with the immensity of the cosmic void. This vulnerability of humanity before the unknown becomes one of the film's key elements. The movie constantly pressures the viewer with scale and emphasizes how fragile the characters are. They are alone. No one will come to help them. They can rely only on each other. And even within that small circle, a threat may be hiding. This isolation from civilization creates far more tension than the typical horror scenario of teenagers sitting in a college dorm. Speaking of age, the characters in Alien are adults. That's unusual for a horror movie. And they are ordinary workers, which is unusual for science fiction. This makes them much easier for audiences to relate to. They aren't heroic explorers. They're truckers who just want to get home and collect their long-awaited bonus.
Mr. Park and I feel that the bonus situation has never been on an equitable level.
Well, you get what you contracted for like everybody else.
Why wasn't science fiction considered mainstream entertainment before? Because it often operated according to rules that feel distant from the audience. Not everyone wants to learn complicated world building or unfamiliar terminology. A sheriff chasing a shark. That's simple and clear. The threat is obvious and the stakes are understandable. That's why Jaws made nearly $500 million. Meanwhile, Charlton Heston landing on the Planet of the Apes became a cult classic but earned only $33 million.
You maniacs! You blew it up!
Star Wars and Alien opened science fiction to mass audiences partly because of relatable characters. A farm boy following the classic hero's journey and a crew of space truckers. They even talk as if it's still 1979 rather than the year 2122, and they smoke on a spaceship. Very impressive safety standards. Characters like Brett, played by Harry Dean Stanton, and Parker, played by Yaphet Kotto, perfectly represent those working-class figures you wouldn't normally expect in a space horror film. So, we've covered the first key elements behind Alien's impact. Directing that emphasizes isolation and characters that the audience can easily connect with. Now let's move on to the next element, the xenomorph itself. The writer struggled for a long time to figure out how the alien would get aboard the ship. It had to be interesting and unexpected. Then Ronald Shusett had a breakthrough idea. The creature should enter the ship inside one of the crew members. A deeply unsettling concept. An extraterrestrial organism living inside you? To heighten tension for male viewers, the victim became Kane, played by John Hurt, rather than a woman as originally planned. Giger's artwork often focused on disturbing biological imagery and symbolic depictions of sexuality. Unsurprisingly, the original design of the alien, whose long head ended in something unmistakably resembling a sexual organ, was altered for the final film. Ridley Scott disliked science fiction horror because it usually ended with a villain in a poorly made rubber suit. So he decided to hide the creature for as long as possible. Let the audience imagine the monster themselves. For the brief moments when the alien does appear, Scott cast Bolaji Badejo, a Nigerian art student whom his agent happened to discover in a bar. Extremely thin with long limbs and standing near 7 feet tall, he immediately caught attention. Even when the alien appears fully on screen, it's difficult for viewers to believe a human actor is inside the suit. And the creature doesn't fully appear until 67 minutes into the film. What do we actually know about the physiology of the monster? From the egg emerges the face hugger. That's the first stage of the xenomorph's life cycle. It implants an embryo into its host, which later bursts from the victim's chest. The incubation time conveniently changes depending on what the plot requires. The newborn stage is called the chest burster, which then grows into a full adult within a matter of hours. Its purpose is simple: kill and reproduce. How exactly? Well, that will be revealed later. For now, it focuses on eliminating the Nostromo crew. The alien isn't just another monster killing victims one by one. It's a fully realized biological species with its own life cycle. And returning to Giger's genius, every stage of that cycle is terrifying. The almost human fingers of the face hugger and its tail wrapped around the victim's throat. The chest burster tearing its way out from within, and the adult creature armed with a razor tail and 2 sets of jaws. Kane's final dinner scene became one of the most memorable moments in film history, and it even shocked the actors themselves. They knew something would burst out of John Hurt's chest, but they weren't warned about the sheer amount of blood and fake organs involved. That's why Veronica Cartwright's reaction, playing Navigator Lambert, feels so real. But beyond the perfect design of the alien, there is something else: the mystery of the unnamed planetoid. There, the Nostromo crew discovers an alien spacecraft and the remains of a giant skeleton. At first, this race was nicknamed the Space Jockey, and only later would they be called the Engineers. But who are they? Why were they transporting the aliens? Were they planning to use them as weapons, or trying to contain them somewhere safe? The film hints that its universe is far larger than it appears. It contains its own mythology, one inaccessible to both the audience and the characters. Once again, this emphasizes how tiny humanity is compared with the endless universe. Soon the xenomorph begins its bloody hunt aboard the Nostromo, and the film surprises the audience again. The first credited actor is Tom Skerritt, playing Captain Dallas, a well-known actor at the time, and yet he becomes the third victim.
Dallas? No.
Alien plays with audience expectations. Logically, the viewer expects to root for the male captain, but instead, the real protagonist turns out to be Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver, who at this point doesn't even have a first name in the film. It was her first major role in a feature film. The story transforms her from a stereotypical damsel in distress into the central figure who defeats the alien, and saves the cat Jonesy, which is very important. I always worry about animals in films like this, and if they survive, it instantly adds several points to the movie in my personal rating. Before facing the alien alone, Ripley encounters another threat. The science officer Ash, played by Ian Holm, turns out to be an android programmed to retrieve the xenomorph specimen for the company, even if that means sacrificing the crew. What makes this twist so effective is that the audience doesn't yet know the rules of this universe, and has no idea androids even exist here. That's why the moment Ash begins leaking white fluid is so memorable. We came to watch humans running from an alien monster, and suddenly the film reveals an entirely new layer. Interestingly, Ash did not exist in the original script. Producer Walter Hill added the character to increase tension. This introduces another theme that will become central to the entire franchise: ruthless corporations obsessed with profit. In the future, this will become one of the main lines in the entire franchise. After the rest of the crew dies, Ripley destroys the Nostromo and escapes aboard the shuttle Narcissus. Then the film surprises us again with a sudden fourth act, because the xenomorph has decided to take a nap in the safest possible place, on the very shuttle meant to save her. Ripley ultimately burns the creature in the engine thrusters and finally enters hypersleep. She doesn't know when or if rescuers will find her. The alien may be dead, but Ripley's future remains uncertain.
This is Ripley, last survivor of the Nostromo. Signing off.
Surprisingly, many critics initially received the film coldly, dismissing it as a typical horror movie. But audiences eagerly brought in more than $180 million at the box office, turning it into a massive hit. Its reputation as the perfect science fiction horror film would come later. And of course, when something becomes that successful, a sequel is inevitable. But Ripley's Awakening would have to wait 7 long years. Because 20th Century Fox didn't believe a sequel would succeed. Studio head Alan Ladd Jr. left his position and started his own company, while his successor Norman Levy had no interest in launching a second Alien. He was convinced the sequel would fail. The studio even inflated the expenses of the first film on paper, claiming that a $10 million movie that made 20 times its budget had somehow been a flop. That led to legal disputes and delayed development of the sequel indefinitely, until a director with fire in his eyes appeared, determined to make a sequel to the cult sci-fi film no matter what. That director was James Cameron. Even before the release of his first hit, The Terminator, he had tried to get the job directing the second Alien, and prepared a rough draft built around the most obvious sequel idea possible: Ripley and soldiers. That was how the producers of the first film briefly described what they wanted to see on screen, and the script was rejected. No one wanted to let the director of the dreadful Piranha 2, The Spawning, anywhere near the project. But then Cameron made the hit Terminator and became the top candidate for the job. There's a famous story that when pitching his idea, James Cameron wrote the word alien on a board and then added an S that looked like a $sign. As the basis for his story, he used his old draft of a film with the working title Mother. It was about an alien monster on a spaceship and the mother from the title protecting her child. After years of arguments, lawsuits, producer changes, and Cameron being fired and rehired as director multiple times, Aliens, that's the title they eventually settled on, finally went into production. Cameron brought along his wife Gail Ann Hurd as one of the producers. He also brought his friend Lance Henriksen, who had missed out on the role of the Terminator, so Cameron gave him the chance to play another memorable android. And of course, he brought his lucky charm Bill Paxton, who had already died at the hands of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Cameron's previous film. Yes, his death is never explicitly confirmed, but I'm pretty sure Arnie didn't leave any witnesses. In the future, Paxton would become a visible part of most of Cameron's films.
Trust me.
So, in 1986, Aliens was released. The film begins with rescuers finally finding Ellen Ripley's shuttle. Yes, that's her full name. Cameron decided to pay tribute to the original movie and borrowed Ridley Scott's style for the opening, slowly observing the inside of Ripley's tiny craft. Only after that does he switch to his own more dynamic storytelling style. It turns out Sigourney Weaver's heroine has been asleep for 57 years. In that time, her 11-year-old daughter, Amanda, had already lived to old age and died. By the way, the woman in the photo is actually the actress's mother, a cute little Easter egg. The company is unhappy with Ripley's behavior and strips her of her pilot's license. While on the planetoid LV-426, that's now the official name of the place where Kane picked up the first facehugger, where colonists had been living for decades.
How many colonists?
I don't know, 60, maybe 70 families.
Jesus.
The colonists themselves call that world Acheron. The company, by the way, also receives its full name now, Weyland-Yutani. There were hints of it in the first film, but all the characters simply referred to it as the Company, which made corporate evil feel faceless and universal. Now the company has a name, revealing a little more of the series' world building. Weyland-Yutani is a fusion of a Western and an Eastern surname. Remember, during the rise of cyberpunk in the 1980s, the West looked with anxiety at rapidly developing Eastern countries and poured that fear into cyberpunk itself. Visions of a near future where the whole world is ruled by Asian corporations. Aliens feels more like post-cyberpunk, showing a world farther removed from us. By the way, it's now the year 2179. Yes, I understand that the term post-cyberpunk refers less to distance and time and more to a different approach to cyberpunk's foundations. I just think the word fits very well here. Naturally, contact with the colonists has been lost, and the seemingly pleasant company man Carter Burke, played by Paul Reiser, persuades Ripley to travel to LV-426 as a consultant. Before Aliens, Reiser had mostly been a funny comic actor, so audiences did not expect that behind his harmless appearance hid what is basically the film's main villain.
I say we grease this rat son of a bitch right now.
With Lance Henriksen's character, the effect is reversed. The audience remembers the vicious Ash from the first film and automatically expects the android Bishop to be dangerous.
You never said anything about an android being on board, why not?
That expectation is reinforced by the actor's not especially friendly appearance. So Cameron tricks the audience twice, making Bishop one of the sweetest and most selfless characters in the movie. But the sequel's biggest innovation is Ripley's companions, the Colonial Marines, highly trained and very overconfident.
I am the ultimate badass. State of the badass art.
Yes, one alien easily wiped out a crew of space truckers, but what could it possibly do against heavily armed soldiers? As it turns out, a lot, especially considering that this time it won't be alone. The plural title isn't there by accident. Cameron completely reworks the concept, replacing a stealthy hunter with swarming hordes of nightmare creatures charging straight ahead. And the internal lore of Alien explains this through different xenomorph subtypes. The creature from the first film is designed to exterminate living beings, while the goal of the aliens on Acheron is reproduction. So they don't just kill their victims, they drag them closer to the facehuggers. The first Aliens sort of tried something similar with the cocoon on the Nostromo, but that scene was cut from the final version, so it doesn't count. In Cameron's film, their official name is spoken for the first time, xenomorphs, meaning alien life form if translated literally. Ripley and the Marines discover the destroyed colony, Hadley's Hope, and its only survivor, a little girl named Rebecca, nicknamed Newt. After the first clash with the aliens, only a handful of Marines remain alive, among them the comic relief character Private Hudson, Bill Paxton. Through his panicking, he voices the audience's own thoughts and lightens the tension a little.
Well, that's great. That's just great, man.
The incredibly fierce Private Vasquez is played by Jeanette Goldstein. I still can't get over the fact that she later appeared in Terminator 2 as John Connor's foster mother.
Hey, Vasquez. Have you ever been mistaken for a man?
No. Have you?
The clumsy commander, Lieutenant Gorman, is played by William Hope. And of course, there's Corporal Hicks, Michael Biehn, the movie's main heartthrob and the obvious pairing candidate for Ripley. But how did the rest of the Marines die so pointlessly? Time to look for a deeper meaning. Cameron's films are brilliant because alongside their basic blockbuster spectacle, they contain interesting ideas and metaphors. The Marines and aliens look like Vietnam-era soldiers for a reason. Everything here points toward the grim outcome of that conflict. Perfectly equipped professionals die one by one when faced with a technologically inferior enemy because they rely entirely on their weapons and their own strength. They already feel like victors, but confidence alone isn't enough here. Why did the Marines go into battle? To satisfy the needs of their employer and someday retire in luxury. In other words, they killed and risked their lives for selfish reasons. That's why they paid with their lives. And just like them, Burke, who thinks only of profit, doesn't make it to the end either. Only Ripley, driven by maternal instinct toward Newt, is able to face down her enemies and survive the battle against the alien queen. The sequel answers the obvious question raised by the first film. If there are eggs, who lays them? Aliens begins as a sci-fi action film about soldiers clashing with hordes of vicious extraterrestrials, and ends as a battle between two mothers.
Get away from her, you bitch!
One is trying to save her newly found child, who has replaced the daughter she lost, while the other is avenging dozens of slaughtered offspring. In the finale, Bishop is torn in half. Hicks is burned by acid blood and the Queen is blasted into open space. 3.5 survivors is actually a pretty good outcome after such a savage slaughter on Acheron.
Not bad for a human.
Yes, survivors. My heart is going to break again very soon, but for now, let's talk about something good. James Cameron wanted to make the most epic action film possible, full of suspense and spectacle, but ran into the problem of a not especially large budget. $18 million is certainly nice, but in an era without convincing CGI and with heavy reliance on practical effects, that is not a huge amount. So the filmmakers got clever. They used mirrors to make limited props look more numerous, for example, the cryosleep chambers. Or they showed the destruction of dozens of aliens through nothing more than an ammo counter. Never have simple numbers on a screen been so exciting. Or they crammed giant muscular men into power loaders, put Ripley on one herself, and created an instantly unforgettable image.
Where you want it?
The film barely allows a moment to breathe. It's a long, tense experience. Even when the characters want to get some sleep, Burke sends a couple of facehuggers their way. All the major characters have arcs. Vasquez grieving over Drake, Gorman transforming from a frightened fool into a hero, Burke's true nature slowly surfacing, and Bishop gradually earning trust. A brief aside, I absolutely love the moment when Vasquez offers the android a weapon. He's so rational that he sees no point in taking the gun. It won't stop an alien. The entire film is built from these kinds of details, indirectly revealing character and offering more and more on every rewatch. Aliens is the gold standard of the science fiction action film, and the greatest sequel ever made. Yes, I know most people will vote for Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but that movie differs far too radically from the original. A cyberpunk slasher turns into a family blockbuster complete with scenes of a killer cyborg learning to smile. It's a great film, but not really a sequel in the traditional sense. It's more of a reinvention of the tone and mood established by the Terminator in 1984. Aliens transforms claustrophobic hide-and-seek with a xenomorph into a full-on action movie with Marines. Yet, still feels like a true continuation of the original rather than a total reimagining. I'm waiting for your opinions in the comments. Maybe there's a third contender for the greatest sequel of all time. Hard to say, but Aliens is my ride or die. Cameron's film wins 2 Oscars for visual effects and sound editing, twice as many as the first film, which got only the visual effects award. What surprises me most is that Sigourney Weaver got an acting nomination. The Academy almost never recognizes performance in action films. In the end, Ripley, the injured Hicks, Newt, and half a Bishop fly home aboard the Sulaco. And, well, this part's gonna be hard, because in 1992, Alien 3 came out, a film I simply hate. Even though it's actually a good film. Atmospheric, creating a new and interesting setting full of excellent performances and test moments. But it has one single detail that creates an overwhelming sense of rejection in me. Alright, let's go step by step. 20th Century Fox had finally seen the box office potential of the franchise. Aliens had made $180 million and began preparing for the third coming of the xenomorphs. But a lot of problems emerged. And by a lot, I mean the kind of problems that usually don't all fall on the shoulders of a single movie. The studio wanted a box office hit, period, which meant spending as little money as possible and shooting it as quickly as possible since the release date had already been set before filming even began. So, all large-scale scripts were immediately ruled out. One of the earliest ideas was a 2-part epic about a war between Earth and socialist separatists. At first, the story would focus on Hicks and Newt, and only at the end of the first film would Ripley appear. Sigourney Weaver was doing everything she could to refuse the role, so they were actively figuring out how to remove her from the story entirely. But no, that was too expensive. The legendary writer William Gibson, the father of cyberpunk, wrote his version of Alien 3, which also featured communist antagonists. Considering the series had criticized capitalist greed, it would have been interesting to introduce their ideological opposites. You can now check out that version in comic book form. It's not a masterpiece, but the idea of people turning into aliens like in a zombie horror movie is definitely interesting. David Twohy, who would later direct Pitch Black with Vin Diesel, wrote his own draft about a prison planet. Better already. Corridors as sets and a minimum of actors. It also satisfied the request of Sigourney Weaver, who had finally agreed to return for a $5 million salary. The film wasn't supposed to have weapons. She didn't like the strong militaristic emphasis of the action genre. In the end, they hired director Vincent Ward, who decided the film should be about a monastery built out of wood. The studio loved it, but asked him to change the building material for the sets. Again, too expensive. In response, the director quit. The producers replaced him with a young music video director named David Fincher, who 3 years after Alien 3 would make the cult thriller Seven, and a whole lot of greatness later on. In the case of Alien 3, his appointment was purely formal, just for show. The studio would take full control into its own hands. This would become the first experience of a brilliant director, one that almost became his last. The studio interfered with every step, rewrote the script almost daily, and scenes that had just been shot suddenly became useless. One of the producers insultingly referred to Fincher not as a director, but as a shoe salesman, since he had previously shot Nike commercials and his opinion was treated as worthless. Remember that iconic shot from Alien 3 where the xenomorph comes right up to Ripley's face but doesn't attack her? Well, the studio was against that scene, and Fincher shot it secretly without permission. Later he would say, "Nobody hates this film as much as I do." And you can understand why. A real trial by fire. So, the film begins with the Sulaco crashing on the prison planet Fiorina 161, or simply Fury, still in the year 2179. In the crash, only Ripley survives. Newt and Hicks don't even make it to the start of the movie.
The corporal was impaled by that safety support. Never knew what hit him.
And Bishop's remains only flash on screen in a single scene before being shut down. And I simply cannot understand why. Bean was willing to return and so was little Newt, but instead we got this.
And the girl.
She drowned in her cryotube.
Alien 3 completely devalues the ending of the previous magnificent film, and if you keep the opening of the third movie in mind while watching Aliens, the entire emotional catharsis collapses. So, for me, despite all its strengths, Alien 3 is simply awful, because it doesn't just damage the third film, it damages the previous one too. Alright, I'll calm down and continue. Just to make sure the aliens aren't to blame, Ripley performs an autopsy on Newt. What is wrong with you people? What were the writers thinking when they wrote a scene where the sweetest character from the previous film, the one who motivated the heroine's entire behavior, gets dissected on screen? Did they think the audience would say, "Wow, that's a bold move. Keep going like that"? I had exactly the opposite reaction. In fact, the Sulaco crash really was caused by a facehugger that had managed to implant a xenomorph embryo inside the sleeping Ripley. But how did alien eggs end up on the Sulaco? Did the Queen clinging to the shuttle lay eggs tirelessly the whole time? The basic idea making Ripley the host is very interesting and adds a lot of drama to her character. But still, how did the facehugger get there? Supplemental materials hint that Bishop brought it aboard, despite his positive image continuing to work for Weyland-Yutani, but the film stays silent about that. Naturally, the threat won't come only from the new queen growing inside Ripley. Yes, some facehuggers can implant special embryos. Another alien will be born from an ox or a dog. The problem is that the film, like Frankenstein's monster, was stitched together from scenes shot from different scripts, with numerous alternate versions of events left lying around. So, if you watch the extended cut, many fragments are changed and the movie becomes more coherent overall. In the theatrical version, the xenomorph bursts out of a Rottweiler, while in the extended version it emerges from a bull raised by the prisoners. Ripley has ended up on a prison planet inhabited by religious convicts. All of them have two Y chromosomes. There's a theory that such a genetic setup stimulates aggression and criminal tendencies. The producers liked both the monastery idea and the prison idea, so rather than choosing one, they combined them. Fury is home to 25 prisoners, 2 wardens and 1 doctor, played by Charles Dance, though technically there are 2 doctors in the film. The insane criminal Golic is played by Paul McGann, also known as the 8th Doctor Who, one of the most memorable characters in the movie. Especially if you watch the extended version where he comes to see the xenomorph as a messiah and frees it from captivity. In the theatrical cut, he simply vanishes from the story for no apparent reason. By the way, the alien here is unusual too, because it was born from an animal that runs on all fours and is often depicted with an animatronic model that looks like weak CGI. Its initial design was once again developed by Hans Rudi Geiger, creator of the original creature design who hadn't been involved since the first film. There are no weapons on Fury, so the characters have to figure out a different way to defeat the alien. They'll cover it in molten lead and then cool it rapidly. That will make it burst apart. And then the main thing happens. Bishop comes to Ripley, or rather, his creator does, looking exactly like him. Weyland-Yutani still wants the specimen, but Ripley clutches the emerging queen to her chest and falls into molten metal, not to be confused with Terminator. The scene works much better in the theatrical version. In the extended cut, she just falls with her arms outstretched, emphasizing sacrifice and crucifixion. In the end, only 1 prisoner survives, Morse. and the company takes him away. So yes, Alien 3 may have spit on the achievements of the previous film, but it did provide the perfect ending for Ellen Ripley's journey. Yes, overall it actually is a good movie. Chases through enclosed corridors, first-person scenes with the alien, fascinating religious prisoners, surprising character deaths, strong arcs for most of the cast, and a truly wonderful tragic ending. And if you're able to accept the deaths of Newt and Hicks more easily than I am, definitely watch the extended version of Alien 3. Then separately watch the ending of the theatrical cut. That really makes it more interesting. But for me, this film simply does not exist.
I think it might be better if I left. I find you unpleasant to be around.
The studio rushed everything, ordered reshoots, and again had to pay Sigourney Weaver extra money. She really did not want to shave her head that short again. But for $50,000, she agreed. In the end, the film's budget rose to $60 million, more than the first two films combined, and the third movie would make a respectable $160 million, which would have looked a lot better in the studio's pocket if the budget had been lower. As it stands, the success was relative. David Fincher survived his first encounter with a major studio and went on to make a pile of great films. And as for Alien, the trilogy was over, as was Ellen Ripley's story arc. You could start looking for new ways to interact with the aliens or bring the iconic heroine back from the dead. If you missed the previous episodes on my channel, there are already videos about Back to the Future and Interstellar. And what videos await you in the future, you'll find out at the end of this one. Joss Whedon, who had already proven himself as an interesting writer, was invited to write the next installment. By that time, he already had the Buffy feature film and contributions to the script of that very same Toy Story behind him. The new movie needed continuity with the previous ones, either continuing the story or bringing back one of the old characters, since that makes it easier to find an emotional connection with the audience. Oh right, they already found that connection in Alien 3. So, the original idea of the script was a cloned Newt who wakes up centuries later and once again fights the alien. Ripley wasn't seriously considered at first. Sigourney Weaver had stated quite clearly that she had no desire to return to the role. However, after several drafts of the resurrected Newt storyline, the studio told Whedon to make Ellen Ripley the main character instead. When Sigourney Weaver was asked why she eventually agreed, her answer was simple: they literally drove a truck full of money up to my house. It's pretty hard to refuse a truck full of money. Rumor has it her fee was $11 million. With that, the powerful ending of Alien 3 was essentially erased. But by that point, the studio was already used to doing that. Because the original concept involved Newt, the film even begins with her line from Aliens, now spoken by Ripley instead.
My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are.
My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are.
The search for a director eventually settled on the promising French filmmaker Jean-Pierre Jeunet. He had already made several very unusual films and was preparing to shoot Amélie, so he was quite surprised that he had been chosen. Yes, the man who directed one of the most famous romantic movies in cinema history also directed the fourth Alien film. And because of Jeunet's directing style, Alien Resurrection, that's the subtitle, feels nothing like the previous entries. It's not horror, not a tense action film, not a claustrophobic thriller. It's... Let's look at the opening scene. Fortunately, you can only find it in the director's cut. At first, it seems like we're seeing a xenomorph, but it turns out to be a poorly rendered CGI bug that a spaceship pilot crushes and then spits through a tube. All of this happens while the film's title appears on screen. A perfect tone setter for a terrifying experience to come. Jeunet often uses strange camera angles, unexpected close-ups, and oddly comedic camera movements. Resurrection tries to do many things except scare the audience. And Joss Whedon complained quite a lot about this. According to him, the director misunderstood his script and, for example, completely missed the playful tone of the space pirates' dialogue.
Who do I have to to get off this boat?
So it was supposed to be even more humorous? Yeah, Whedon loves witty teams constantly teasing each other and facing problems with sarcasm. Later he would create the famous series Firefly, whose characters strongly resemble the crew of the Betty from Alien Resurrection. A female mechanic, a brave captain, an aggressive muscle guy. That's classic Whedon, a big fan of ensemble adventures. Anyway, back to the plot. 200 years have passed since Alien 3. The year is now 2379, or maybe 2381. The sources differ. An evil military organization clones Ripley, and the alien queen still inside her extracts it and breeds a small group of aliens using kidnapped civilians kept in cryosleep. Those people are delivered by the pirates aboard the Betty, among whom hides the independent android Call, played by Winona Ryder. She has discovered the military's plan and wants to stop the spread of the aliens. And by the way, it's no longer Wayland Yutani. The infamous evil corporation has vanished.
Ripley A's former employers.
Terran growth conglomerate.
Meanwhile, Ripley grows in captivity. She's become super strong, extremely durable, and even has acid in her blood.
What the hell are you?
Something of a predator, isn't she?
During cloning, her genes became mixed with the Queen's DNA, so she's not exactly the same Ripley we once knew. By the way, in this scene, Sigourney Weaver really did throw the basketball into the hoop herself. It's not CGI. After numerous attempts, Jean-Pierre Jeunet lost patience and wanted to add the ball digitally, but the actress managed to make the shot on the final try. According to Weaver, it was one of the happiest moments of her life. The director originally wanted to use CGI from the start, but Weaver, who was also a co-producer, insisted on doing it herself. Yes, she wasn't always the easiest person to work with. Naturally, the aliens escape. Demonstrating impressive cunning, they simply kill one of their own and burn their way out with acid blood. Immediately afterward, they capture the lead scientist, played by Brad Dourif, the perfect actor for Jeunet's slightly psychedelic style. Ripley joins forces with Call and the crew of the Betty to deal with the aliens before they reach Earth. Resurrection constantly balances between unprecedented brutality, killing characters in ways the franchise had never done before, and carefree absurdity. The overall feeling is extremely strange. Truly tragic moments such as the storyline of the kidnapped man carrying an embryo suddenly end with the chest burster smashing through the skull of his attacker. Visually impressive, unusual, spectacular, but extremely grotesque.
What?
The climax of the film is the confrontation with the newborn alien. Ripley didn't just gain xenomorph abilities, she also passed some of her human traits to the Queen. As a result, the Queen gives birth to a disturbing hybrid of human and alien.
Beautiful butterfly.
Hans Rudy Geiger originally considered giving the first xenomorph eyes and a more human skull shape, but everyone agreed the faceless design was better. Now that abandoned concept finally appeared on screen. For the final kill, they invented a disturbing scene where Ripley's grandchild is sucked into space through a tiny hole in the ship's hull. Again, an extremely unsettling moment, a victory that brings no joy. The ship carrying the remaining aliens crashes on Earth. Hopefully nobody on the planet was hurt. Ripley, meanwhile, receives something resembling a happy ending. The xenomorphs are gone. For the first time, humanity can breathe easy. The director's cut ends with shots of a ruined Paris. Not for nothing had the characters referred to humanity's homeworld as a kind of dump. Apparently, in 200 years, the planet suffered multiple catastrophes. The film earned about $160 million on a $70 million budget, not exactly a huge success. Joss Whedon began developing a fifth film that would take place on Earth, but Sigourney Weaver disliked that direction. She said she would happily return for another sequel if the story truly interested her, but soon the studio's plans for further Ripley adventures were pushed aside. Alien 5 would be killed by another extraterrestrial species, the Yautja. Independent xenomorph films would enter a long hypersleep. Now would be the moment to talk about the Alien vs. Predator series, but I'll skip it for now. I'll explain why at the end of the video. Instead, let's briefly talk about xenomorphs in books, comics, and video games. This is important to understand one key idea. You can make almost any kind of project with Alien on any scale. In the future, Sir Ridley Scott, the director of the very first film, would say that aliens themselves are no longer that interesting, and that there are no more good stories left to tell about them. According to him, it's much more interesting to explore where they came from. And here I strongly disagree, because on the pages of books and comics, the aliens prove exactly the opposite. In 1988, a comic book sequel to James Cameron's film began to be published, continuing the story of Newt and Hicks. Yes, in this version of the universe they survived. The poor girl grows up in a psychiatric hospital where the evil corporation sends her so she won't tell anyone about their potentially profitable discovery. Hicks tries to return to military service but eventually ends up in prison. Years later, they reunite for another dangerous mission together with a group of android Marines. Newt even falls in love with one of them, unaware of his true nature. Eventually, they encounter the space jockeys, uncover a corporate conspiracy, while at the same time, cultists who worship the xenomorph destroy Earth. The comic also expands on the biology of the creatures. In this version, an isolated alien can transform into a queen to continue the species. In other words, they are effectively hermaphroditic. It's a great story that later became the basis for several novels. And here's an interesting detail. A book adaptation of the first comic arc was released as promotional material for Alien 3. In other words, a story about new adventures of Newt and Hicks was meant to accompany a film where those characters die. So the book changed their names. The heroes became Billy and Wilkes, whose relationship suspiciously resembles that of the characters from Aliens. Later, their names were changed in the comic reprints as well. After all, it wouldn't look very good to show readers that a perfectly good story could have been told without killing those characters in the opening minutes. In general, Alien comics are basically a creative competition among writers. Everyone tries to extract something unusual from the image of the cosmic monster. The number of alien subspecies keeps increasing. We get the Alien King, red xenomorphs that fight the traditional black ones, horned alpha variants, and many others. The monsters appear in our own time and even battle an ancestor of Ellen Ripley. One scientist creates an android that looks like an alien, terrifying on the outside but kind on the inside. And what about attempts to destroy the aliens with a pig strapped to a nuclear device? Yes, that actually happened too. Authors have already told countless fascinating stories about xenomorphs in books and comics, and they clearly have no intention of stopping. Video games are slightly more modest in comparison, but they also have their own gems. For example, Alien Isolation, which takes place between the first two films. The main character is Amanda, Ellen Ripley's daughter. As an adult, she becomes a mechanic and faces a xenomorph aboard the Sevastopol space station. The game is filled with tense hide-and-seek gameplay with the alien, encounters with malfunctioning synthetic androids, and some great plot twists. Every fan of the series should play it. One especially charming detail is that all the computers in the game use the distinctive retro interface from the first Alien film. It's wonderful. And of course, we should mention Aliens Colonial Marines, but only briefly. It promised an excellent story-driven action game and ended up being a buggy disaster that entered video game history as one of the worst projects ever released. Today, more and more interesting games of different genres are appearing, from multiplayer shooters to tactical simulations. But we'll come back to that later. The important thing is what we've just seen with our own eyes. There are still plenty of stories to tell about the aliens. Creators are given a brilliant creature design and allowed to experiment with it however they want. It's a perfect creative playground. But Ridley Scott remained unconvinced. For him, the alien itself was only a side effect. What really mattered was telling the story of their creators, the mysterious space jockeys. And if he ever returned to the franchise, it would only be to explore their origins. Crossovers between Alien and Predator didn't interest him at all. Scott believed such projects reduced the greatness of the series and the creature itself to a cheap action spectacle. And in some ways he was right, but again, we'll get back to that later. By the end of the 2000s, Ridley Scott was finally ready. And notice something interesting. Before this, he had never returned to any of his previous films. In 2012, Prometheus was released, the first prequel in the director's career. We'll still talk about this film even though the alien itself is practically absent from it. At first, Ridley Scott said it was a separate project that simply carried the DNA of Alien. Later, he changed his statement and called it a full prequel set in the same universe. Everything about it was mysterious and extremely intriguing. For marketing, the film actively used the internet and released several viral videos. In one of them, Guy Pearce plays Peter Weyland, the very founder of Weyland-Yutani, giving a speech at a major conference. In another, Michael Fassbender is introduced as the android David. After that, we see the rest of the characters, but almost no plot details are revealed. Prometheus was later rewritten by Damon Lindelof. Yes, the same guy who spent years making the series Lost. In other words, a master of throwing endless questions at the audience and not providing clear answers, even by the finale. You can probably imagine what awaits us here. The film begins with a pale alien sacrificing himself to seed life on Earth. In the year 2093, 29 years before the events of the first Alien film, a group of researchers aboard the ship Prometheus sets out to find their creators. The captain is played by Idris Elba, the corporate executive by Charlize Theron, and the main heroine is Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, portrayed by Noomi Rapace. And when the audience is introduced to the crew, questions begin to appear, and clearly not the ones Mr. Lindelof intended. One of the most common complaints from critics and viewers is that the main characters are not particularly intelligent. They are briefed about the mission only after arriving at the planetoid LV-223.
So you're saying we're here because of a map you two kids found in a cave, is that right?
The scientists insult each other, ignore basic instructions, remove their helmets inside an alien structure, and when they see a suspicious snake-like creature, they try to pet it.
She's a lady, look.
With predictable results. If a predator had been on that planet, its code of honor would not have allowed it to touch the crew of the Prometheus. They are already doing an excellent job eliminating themselves. But fine, all the humans here are basically expendable and it doesn't really matter how they exit the story. The film's real strength is David, played by Fassbender, one of the most interesting characters in the entire series and eventually a fantastic main villain. At first, he's simply a synthetic serving the crew. He enjoys watching Lawrence of Arabia, wants to resemble Peter O'Toole, and feels genuinely offended whenever people dismiss his humanity.
Making you guys pretty close, huh?
Not too close, I hope.
And then suddenly, he poisons one of the crew members with an alien pathogen, the character played by Logan Marshall Green. That man manages to impregnate Dr. Shaw before dying. And after an intense cesarean scene, the first proto-facehugger emerges from her body. Now it's time to connect this film to the rest of the series. On the planetoid, the crew of the Prometheus finds buildings and ships belonging to the mysterious race whose remains the Nostromo crew would later discover. The Engineers, that's what the space jockeys are now called, had been developing a weapon of mass destruction here intended to wipe out Earth, destroy what they themselves had created. Their appearance is now much closer to human. In the comics, they were sometimes drawn with something resembling a trunk, inspired by the skeleton on Acheron, but that turned out to be just a helmet. Throughout the film, the characters search for answers to the questions posed earlier in an introductory speech by Guy Pearce, under heavy old age makeup.
Where do we come from? What is our purpose? What happens when we die?
But they never received those answers. Ridley Scott had become interested in themes of religion, human existence, mortality, and the meaning of life. His age and personal tragedies clearly influenced the film. So Prometheus is built around the search for answers that humanity may never actually find. That's why the film deliberately refuses to answer its own questions. Lindelof at his finest. Why did the Engineers create life on Earth? Why did they later want to destroy it? Why did they leave coordinates to their planet on ancient cave paintings but attack the humans who followed them? It doesn't matter. Scott emphasizes that the search itself will not produce answers. Faith in God is not about locating him or scientifically proving the origin of life. That's why Holloway, who arrogantly tries to challenge religion, dies, while the deeply religious Shaw survives until the end. The film is saturated with symbolism. Even the title refers to the mythological titan Prometheus, who defied the gods and gave fire to humanity, bringing people closer to the divine and suffering for it. Obviously, the crew of a ship with that name isn't destined for a happy ending. There is something that might hint at the Engineers' motivations. In the original script, there was a longer scene where David communicates with the surviving engineer. The engineer explains that they are a race of creators. They generate life and help it evolve, but humanity's aggression made them question their mission. At one point, they even sent a kind of divine messenger to Earth to guide humans onto the right path, and humans crucified him. Yes, in that early script, Jesus was actually an engineer. After that, the creators lost patience and decided to destroy their rebellious creation. But that idea remained only on paper. In the finished film, the surviving engineer silently kills the secretly revived elderly Wayland and tears David's head off, leaving both the audience and the characters without answers.
There's nothing Right now.
The core intention of the film was precisely this, to torture the audience with questions and refuse to provide solutions. And I actually like what Prometheus tries to do. I just don't like how it does it. The atmosphere of exploring unknown planets is excellent. Visually, it's beautiful and spectacular. But the characters behave like they're in the most basic slasher movie. That completely contradicts both the deeper themes and their supposed professional expertise. By the way, the design of the massive structure with the skull on top was originally created by Hans Rudi Geiger for Alejandro Jodorowsky's legendary unrealized adaptation of Dune. It was supposed to be the palace of House Harkonnen. Decades later, the design finally appeared on screen, just in a different context. Another strange detail, technology decades before the original Alien somehow looks more advanced. No retro computers, no green letters on black screens. The ship is cleaner and much more typical of modern sci-fi design. Stylistically, it's difficult to place Prometheus right before the original film. In the finale, the proto-facehugger implants an embryo into an engineer, producing the first proto-alien, called the Deacon in supplementary materials. In church hierarchy, a deacon is a lower-rank servant. The surviving Shaw and the severed head of David travel to the engineer's homeworld to search for answers. After the death of his creator, the android finally gains freedom, and haunted by questions about his own purpose. He remembers the earlier experiment with the engineer pathogen on Marshall Green's character. In that moment, he witnessed the creation of a new life form, a chance to defy humanity's claim that he is not truly alive. After the death of God, he decides to become one himself.
Why do you think your people made me? We made you because we could.
Prometheus earned about $400 million on a $120 million budget, a solid result. Even before the premiere, Ridley Scott hinted that he would not mind continuing the story, and that he still had more to say. In his own words, to approach the original Alien from the back door. And he did. 5 years later, Alien Covenant was released.
Y'all have fun.
And with that title, the director technically didn't contradict his earlier words. As you may remember, Ridley Scott had claimed that xenomorphs were no longer interesting to audiences, and yet, here the word alien suddenly appears in the title again. But Scott meant something different. He wasn't referring to the space monster, but to David, artificial intelligence, a new kind of alien enemy to humanity. Yes, Michael Fassbender returns to the role, actually to two roles. Another android appears in the film who looks exactly like David. By the way, notice an interesting detail. In the first film, there was Ash, then Bishop. In Resurrection, there was Call and then David. Take the first letters and you get A, B, C, D, which means the next android should start with E, Edward or Eric.
Walter, when in Rome.
Well, that theory didn't survive very long. 11 years after the Prometheus journey, the spaceship Covenant, carrying 2,000 colonists, is traveling to colonize a new planet. An unexpected accident kills the captain, and the crew receives a mysterious transmission, the song Take Me Home, Country Roads by John Denver. The first character to die is played by James Franco. In fact, he appears only in photos, video recordings, and briefly while his cryopod burns. He also shows up in the promotional short film The Last Supper. Probably got into the project thanks to his friend Danny McBride, who plays the pilot here. The signal comes from an unknown planet, and our brave colonists, who are responsible for 2,000 people and hundreds of unborn embryos, decide, maybe we shouldn't continue to the carefully studied planet we've spent years preparing for. Maybe we should just settle here instead.
Got the housing units right over there, civic complex beyond the burn.
If the behavior of the Prometheus crew annoyed you, the Covenant crew will truly impress you. They leave the ship without protective suits, wander off alone to smoke, walk around without looking where they step, and stick their dumb heads into unfamiliar alien plants.
This is good judgment based on all the data available.
Honestly, maybe humanity sent them away from Earth because they were simply too dangerous in their carelessness. Even on Earth, a dense forest can be dangerous, and here it's an entirely new world they knew absolutely nothing about. What if there were alien bears here? Once again, the character's behavior becomes the biggest flaw of a film that actually contains many interesting ideas. It turns out the new planet is the very same paradise David and Shaw were trying to reach, presumably the homeworld of the engineers, whom the android, now convinced he is a god, has already wiped out. That becomes the film's answer to the question of the engineers' motives. They're dead and therefore cannot explain anything. Meanwhile, David has become obsessed with experimentation. Between the films, he performs vivisection and dissects Dr. Shaw. So much for the new Ripley replacement. The series really loves to kill characters you just started to care about, casually off screen. David is obsessed with the act of creation. Only through creating life can he feel equal to a god and satisfy his own complexes.
You seek your creator. I am looking at mine. You will die. I will not.
He wants to break free from the role of servant that humans designed for him and rise above his creators. Through him, the film explores humanity's growing rejection of religion and its attempts to become godlike itself, something that rarely leads to good outcomes. The more a person believes they are superior, the more monstrous their actions become. Walter, the android who is more loyal to humans, cannot compete with David's obsession with power and is ultimately killed by his own double, but not before they share a strange moment, playing the flute together and kissing themselves. Michael Fassbender must have had a fascinating experience watching the final cut of this film. In the end, only two characters survive, the one played by Danny McBride and the new Almost Ripley character played by Catherine Waterston. They enter hypersleep while David secretly takes control of the ship and transports the colonists to a distant planet where he plans to begin brutal experiments on them in order to create the perfect life form. The end. Wait, what about the alien itself? This time it actually gets more screen time than in Prometheus. Two members of the Covenant crew become infected by the engineer pathogen and give birth to neomorphs, pale creatures that resemble aliens but are not quite the same. Later, when David tests a facehugger on the new captain played by Billy Crudup, we finally see something closer to the original creature. Not yet a xenomorph, but a protomorph. This is the closest the two prequel films ever get to the classic alien design. That's how the legendary life form is supposedly born. According to this version of the story, it emerges as the result of experiments on the engineer's bioweapon, conducted by a deranged android with a god complex on a remote planet. 18 years later, the events of the original Alien will take place. Somehow, during that time, the engineer's ship will end up on a distant planetoid filled with eggs of the final xenomorph form that David plans to create once he reaches his destination. Subtract another 7 years of travel time to reach that planet. The clock is ticking, so let's think about it. What answers did Alien Covenant actually give us? It revealed that the alien was created by Fassbender's character, and that's basically it. Everything else in the film focuses on the twisted desire of a mad artificial being to break its chains and become a god, and on a group of incredibly careless colonists. I still believe David is a fantastic antagonist, and if he had been placed among characters with even a tiny sense of self-preservation, the conflict could have been much more interesting. Ridley Scott planned another film that would move even closer to the events of the original Alien, not closer to the creature itself. Scott still isn't very interested in that, but closer to the timeline of the first movie. The director is fascinated by the idea of aggressive artificial intelligence, a fear that feels extremely relevant for modern society, especially for someone born in 1937. In interviews, Sir Scott also clarified that the engineers killed by David were not actually the original engineers, but merely one of the species they themselves had created, which explains why they greeted the ship so enthusiastically. If the true creators are still alive, a much larger conflict could still happen. It's a shame that aliens themselves were never part of this plan. But this is where we leave David and his experiments behind. In 2019, Disney bought 20th Century Fox and abandoned Ridley Scott's plans for future films. With a budget of about $110 million, Alien Covenant made only $240 million. Not a particularly strong result for a major blockbuster. The new owner of the franchise decided to take an important step and, believe it or not, focus future films on the xenomorph itself, the creature that truly sells the entire franchise, and honestly, its design is nothing short of genius. In pop culture, such iconic visual designs are extremely rare, when a single silhouette instantly signals something terrifying and powerful. Add a solid script on top of that and you have a guaranteed box office hit. That's exactly what director Fede Alvarez did when he rebooted the franchise with Alien Romulus, and in doing so broke the ending of the first Alien film. Alien Romulus had an incredibly difficult, almost impossible task in front of it. It had to please fans of the original films by Ridley Scott and James Cameron, while also giving a nod to the later entries in the saga, Prometheus and Covenant. Those films may not have been warmly received overall, but every one of them has its admirers. And Sir Ridley had to be respected too. Otherwise, he might lose his temper and cut the series off at the source. He may not own all the rights, but he still has serious influence. Alien 3 and Resurrection are usually the films people prefer not to mention. In essence, Romulus had to revive and reboot a dying franchise, satisfy the fans, and offer Disney possible directions for turning the xenomorph into a fully milked franchise asset.
I own all this shit now! It's all mine!
Isn't that a little too ambitious for a small-scale space thriller with a budget of only $80 million? Who even makes movies for that kind of money these days, when $150 million has become the standard middle range? The result surprised everyone. First, let's travel back to 2015 and the first attempt to reboot Alien. Remember Neil Blomkamp, once considered one of the most promising directors around? He blew audiences away with District 9 and became an icon of a new generation of sci-fi filmmakers. With his harsh, gritty approach to material, many saw him as the perfect candidate to direct a new Alien. After Prometheus, Ridley Scott wasn't eager to return to the series, while the franchise clearly needed to keep moving. Neil Blomkamp, a huge fan of the first two Alien films, decided to take a radical route. He would ignore the films by David Fincher and Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and continue directly from James Cameron's movie, with Hicks and Newt alive instead of being mercilessly destroyed by the creators of Alien 3. Fans lit up at the idea and eagerly awaited the return of their favorite characters. But Chappie, Blomkamp's robot film, flopped at the box office. 20th Century Fox got nervous. Then Sir Ridley, jealous of his own creation, suddenly became eager to make another Alien himself, and Blomkamp's project was killed before it could even be born. That led to Covenant, the continuation of Prometheus, underwhelming box office, and another outburst from Ridley Scott. He slammed the door on the way out, declaring that xenomorphs were no longer interesting to anyone. After several years of uncertainty about how to continue the series and after Disney bought Fox, a new candidate emerged to revive Alien, director Fede Alvarez. Who is that? Well, we should say a few words about the new director. The Uruguayan filmmaker steadily climbed the career ladder and made several short films that critics liked quite a bit. Then Alvarez was trusted with rebooting Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, and that turned out to be a pretty solid movie that performed well at the box office. A small teaser, a new Evil Dead film comes out this summer, and I'll be covering that cult horror series in a new Ultimate History video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Then Alvarez would score a massive hit with Don't Breathe, about a blind sadist and teenagers trying to rob him. We won't talk about that terrible movie, The Girl in the Spider's Web. Everyone has misfires. It was Alvarez who got the job of developing a new Alien. Since Ridley Scott had abandoned the David storyline halfway through, a new path had to be found, and Alvarez found one. Continuing Resurrection was complicated. Bringing Ripley back again was just as problematic. The franchise needed to learn how to live without Sigourney Weaver's heroine. In the entire Alien timeline, there was exactly one perfect place to set a new story, and other works in the universe had already explored it. I mean the video game Alien Isolation, that period between the first and second films. While Ellen Ripley is floating somewhere in space waiting to be rescued, an unprepared humanity could easily run into xenomorphs. Sounds like a plan. But then Alvarez shocked the public with his creative decision. The main characters of the new Alien movie would be teenagers.
Oh my God!
Everyone had exactly one question in mind, but why teenagers? Well, let's answer it. The idea for Romulus came to Alvarez when he was watching the director's cut of Aliens. There's a small scene there showing the lives of the colonists on Acheron. In particular, you can see children playing on the base. Alvarez wondered what would happen to those colonist kids 10 years later. What kind of conditions would they end up in? And there was another reason. Teenagers don't know how to do anything. That's a very important point. Audiences constantly complain about the stupid behavior of soldiers or scientists in extreme situations. And I'm not even talking about the pilots of a colony ship deciding to stroll around an unknown planet without respirators. But that kind of behavior is necessary for the classic structure of a space thriller. Make the characters too smart and too competent, and viewers start accusing them of cheating or being Mary Sues. That's what people call heroes who get out of every difficult situation a little too perfectly. But teenage stupidity is expected, and it makes impulsive decisions easier to justify. Of course, for the sake of casting and difficult scenes, the actors' ages were bumped up over 20. That's perfectly normal in the film industry. Alien needs a Ripley. That's why Ridley Scott introduced Ripley-like substitutes in Prometheus and Covenant, with rather poor results. This time it's Rain, played by Kaylee Spaney. She is constantly accompanied by the android Andy, played by David Johnson. In my opinion, the best character in the film. At first it seems like he'll spend the entire movie being a little off-putting with his detached behavior, but as soon as he gets his firmware update, he becomes a completely different character. A very smart piece of casting and characterization. I can't really say much about the rest of the characters. They exist mostly to scream and die at the hands of xenomorphs. Let's say a few words about the setup. Weyland-Yutani once again fully confirms its status as the villain. They don't just terraform planets across the galaxy and desperately want to acquire a xenomorph specimen. They literally keep millions of colonists and their children in slavery, where they regularly die in the mines from horrific diseases. And as soon as their contract with the corporation ends, it gets renewed again and again.
Unfortunately, quotas have been raised to 24,000 hours, so you'll be released from contract in another 5 to 6 years.
A group of young people, unhappy with their situation, decide to flee the colony, Jackson Star, and head for the planet Ivaga. That name is another hidden detail, because Ivaga means paradise. But there's a problem. The trip to Ivaga takes 9 years. Too long to survive in their tiny ship, the Corbelan. They need cryopods to endure the journey. Their search leads them to the abandoned Renaissance station made up of 2 modules, Remus and of course Romulus, where the climax will take place. They're named after the legendary founders of Rome. The motivation is completely understandable, but on the station they encounter xenomorphs. At first, Fede Alvarez proposed hiding the fact that Alien was even part of the film. People would go to see some random space thriller from a decent director and only gradually realize it was a new Alien movie. Dan Trachtenberg, who directed Prey about Predator and Native Americans, wanted something similar. He really wanted to surprise audiences. At the end of the video, I'll talk about my own plans for the Predator universe. But in both cases, the studio pointed out one obvious problem. How do you sell the film without connecting it to a major franchise? The directors couldn't answer that question, so the famous monsters were dragged out of the shadows and made part of the marketing. Back to the story. How did the xenomorphs get onto Renaissance Station? Well, this is where we need to talk about the place of Romulus within the larger universe, and about how it kills the ending of the first Alien. The film takes place in 2142. That's 20 years after the events of the original Alien. That film was set in 2122, and there are still more than 30 years left before Ellen Ripley is thawed out in Cameron's Aliens, which takes place in 2179. The earliest event in the timeline had been Prometheus in 2093, so an important question appears. How exactly did the alien end up on Renaissance Station? You know, I always thought the opening of Alien 3 devalued Cameron's film. Killing everyone except Ripley right at the beginning is a very questionable plot move. Well, Romulus devalues the climax of a different entry in the series, the original Alien. Remember how Sigourney Weaver's character blasted the creature out into space? Well, it didn't die. It was recovered by Weyland-Yutani, and from its DNA they created a bunch of face huggers. Then, from those, they extracted the same pathogen the engineers wanted to use to destroy Earth in Prometheus. In just 2 lines of script, Romulus ties its story not only to the first film, but also to Ridley Scott's Prometheus. Peter Weyland's trip to the cradle of humanity is fully canon.
I've turned it into the miracle Mr. Weyland died searching for. Prometheus fire.
Which means Weyland-Yutani received Ripley's message and already had experience with xenomorphs, so they knowingly sent the colonists of Acheron to their deaths in order to lure the aliens out. That's brutal, even for them. Among the special features of Alien, Romulus, one deserves particular attention. It's not just a standalone film, but a true feast of fan service. Lovers of the first 2 films will be choking on nostalgia. Let's continue with that, the main Easter eggs. Romulus feels like it's built entirely out of references, starting with the opening titles, which directly copy the first film in the series. The title appears piece by piece. Then there's a slow tour through the interior of the ship, and most importantly, the technology. It looks closer to the original Alien than to the elegant holographic designs of Prometheus. At first glance, that looks like a continuity error, as if the filmmakers sacrificed internal logic for nostalgia and for cohesion with the earlier movies. But the director has an answer. Weyland was a billionaire, so of course his equipment equipment would be far more advanced than what ordinary space truckers or colonists would have access to. Sounds logical, but no. If you consider that nearly 30 years passed between Prometheus and the first Alien, and nearly 50 years by the time of Romulus, it's easy to assume that Weyland's cutting-edge tech from 2093 would be standard by 2142, especially on a secret research station. At the very least, they should have had 4K televisions by then, so no matter how much you explain it with social inequality, technological progress doesn't stop, and the retro look of Romulus is clearly nostalgia bait rather than natural world building.
Rain, are you sure about this?
Only one way to find out.
To strengthen the connection with earlier films, Fede Alvarez insisted on using as many practical effects as possible. CGI xenomorphs simply don't look as interesting as animatronics. It's no surprise that Romulus got its only Oscar nomination precisely for visual effects. True, it lost to Dune Part 2. My favorite practical effects detail in the film is the look of the final boss. At the end, the heroine has to fight a human xenomorph hybrid, and believe it or not, it's basically just a man in makeup. The only thing added digitally is the tail. He was played by the Romanian-Hungarian basketball player Robert Bobracki, who stands 7 feet 7 inches tall. All you have to do is place him next to Kaylee Spaney, who is only 5 foot 1 inch, and no extra effects are needed. The filmmakers put a huge amount of effort into the look of the Renaissance Station modules. Remus, where the story begins, draws much more from Ridley Scott's Alien, while Romulus resembles the corridors from James Cameron's film. And by combining the two, the movie creates a powerful symbol, the union of the suspense and terror of the first film with the large-scale action of the second. As a good reboot, Romulus doesn't focus on one specific element of the series, but tries to gather together everything people loved about the different films in the franchise. Besides the overall tone, you can spot Aspen beer in the frame, another recurring drink in the Alien universe. And when one of the characters, Bjorn, plays a video game, we hear a reference to Private Hudson's famous line delivered by Bill Paxton.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
And of course, we can't forget this iconic line.
Get away from her, you bitch.
Ellen Ripley would have been proud.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Now for the biggest reference in Romulus, the return of Ian Holm as the android Ash. 4 years after the actor's death, he passed away in 2020. Technically, the character here is called Rook, the chief scientist experimenting with xenomorph DNA. The filmmakers really wanted to include someone from the earlier films in the story, but didn't know who. Ripley is asleep in space, and there's basically no one else left. Then someone proposed bringing back Ash with the permission of Holmes' family, and that idea came from Ridley Scott, who read the script before production began and made a whole bunch of notes. Thanks to him, Rook was added and the movie was cut down to 2 hours. Before that, it had about 30 extra minutes of scenes. Holmes' face was deep-faked onto a puppet strongly resembling the one used in the first Alien. And honestly, it's probably the worst visual effect in the film.
Run. Get out. However you got it.
They even improved that detail later for the digital release after the theatrical run. But despite the technical awkwardness, Rook ends up being a very effective villain, obsessed with improving humanity through the engineer's pathogen. From a story perspective, the character is used to the fullest, and they even quote the original film.
I can't lie about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
Half of the body is found lying next to the now truly dead xenomorph from the first Alien. How did he get there? Well, that was explained in a prequel comic, which you really shouldn't read, especially if you're the kind of person who gets annoyed by the scientists and Prometheus taking off their helmets. Because Renaissance Station is destroyed thanks to 2 idiot guards. Compared to them, the young crew in Romulus are the most careful people alive, while the side characters die exactly as expected, while Rain escapes with an injured Andy and heads for Ivago. What happens to them next is hard to say, but Rain turned out to be a very good new Ripley, and you could easily spend a couple of decades sending her all across the galaxy in 10 more movies. And so, on August 16, 2024, a full 45 years after the first film, Alien Romulus was released. Audiences brought $350 million into theaters. With a budget of $80 million, that's a fantastic result. Critics received Romulus kindly, calling it a strong continuation of the series and fresh air in a stagnant franchise. Whatever Ridley Scott may say, Alien still interests mass audiences. It's the xenomorph itself and the strange, almost cyberpunk setting around it that draws people in, not philosophical debates about the origin of Earth, and audiences confirm that with Romulus's very healthy box office. The success now needs to be strengthened with new projects, and for that the studio will bring in a truly excellent creator, Noah Hawley, who has a genuinely unusual approach to storytelling. Under his leadership, the series Alien Earth will be released and will erase all the goodwill created by the successful reboot, once again making fans fear for the future of the franchise. Noah Hawley had already proven himself to be a great storyteller by bringing the Coen brothers' Fargo to television. He perfectly captured the director's style and created a bleak but hilarious story full of stupid or evil characters. More often than not, both stupid and evil. Then he strengthened his reputation by giving X-Men fans Legion, a series as far removed from typical comic book adaptations as possible. The choice of showrunner seemed perfect, and the first season's budget was $250 million, which is a huge amount of money. Hawley planned to tell us more about life on Earth and finally unleash the xenomorphs on our planet, something we had never seen on screen before. Every step of Alien Earth's development inspired excitement and anticipation. But sometimes it's worth remembering one very important fan rule: excessive expectations can lead to enormous disappointment. The events of the series take place 2 years before Alien, meaning in 2120. It turns out the crew of the Nostromo were far from the first humans to encounter xenomorphs. Before them, that terrible fate befell the crew of the Mazano, who had collected all kinds of dangerous creatures from across the galaxy on behalf of Weyland-Yutani. Now it makes more sense why Ash wanted so badly to secure a specimen for his employers. They had already encountered them before, and yes, you could say that before the Mazano, the characters of Prometheus and Covenant had already run into proto-aliens. But there's one important point here. While developing the series, Noah Hawley basically waved away Ridley Scott's later projects in this universe. So, Alien Earth exists slightly to the side of the overall canon. For example, Weyland-Yutani already exists by the middle of the 21st century, even though we remember that in 2093 the Prometheus mission was organized by Weyland Corporation, which had not yet merged with its Asian partner. So we get a strange situation. On one hand, there's Romulus trying to keep both the classic films and Ridley Scott's newer version within one canon. And on the other hand, there's Earth ignoring the lore that was only just established. But that's far from the show's biggest problem. So, the crew of the Mazano captures the most dangerous organisms from around the galaxy and brings them to Earth. A xenomorph, a carnivorous flower, cunning tricks that feed on blood and secretly place their larvae into water consumed by unsuspecting humans, flies that love synthetic flesh, and the real star of the series, Eyeball. His proper name is Ocellus, but I like Eyeball more. Strangely enough, in Alien Earth, the creature that grabs the most attention is not the xenomorph at all, but this genius eye creature that can take over the bodies of any biological species. Although if you think about it, not just any species, but specifically ones with eyeballs. Which immediately raises a question. So, this thing was captured on a world populated by aliens whose eyeballs are somehow very close to ours? Otherwise, how could Eyeball even exist there without hosts? Isn't that discovery more important than the flesh-eating ticks? Aren't those the kinds of questions we should be asking in a project about Alien? And yes, we've reached that point. Alien Earth raises far too many questions. On one hand, Noah Hawley wrote a fairly strong story about what humanity is, what identity is, and what human cruelty really means. What does it even mean to be human? But on the other hand, the plot keeps moving forward only because one character forgets to hold a door or carelessly leaves an open bottle of water somewhere. If you thought the characters of Ridley Scott's later films behaved strangely, these people will amaze you. It's especially funny that the central characters of the story are children in adult bodies. Fede Alvarez justified the impulsive behavior of his characters by making them teenagers. Noah Hawley went even further and built the plot around child androids. The Prodigy Corporation is running an experiment to transfer consciousness into synthetic bodies and creates a squad of robot kids, then immediately sends them to the crash site of a starship full of dangerous creatures. Yes, Boy Carvallier, the head of Prodigy, personally orchestrated the Mazanotes' crash and knows exactly what is inside. That, by the way, is one of the series' genuinely solid elements, the focus on corporate conflict within a cyberpunk setting. Alien has never been this close to that genre as it is here on Earth. Synthetic beings run around next to augmented humans, corporations are swimming in power and dreaming of immortality. A little more and Rick Deckard from Blade Runner will come walking past. And that resemblance is not accidental. Ridley Scott himself has said more than once that in his opinion, Alien and Blade Runner take place in the same universe. So drop a like and I'll definitely do a big video about the Blade Runner universe. If you dig through the Blu-ray bonus materials, you'll find out that Dallas, the captain from the first Alien, once worked for the Tyrell Corporation, the very company that creates replicants in Blade Runner, and Peter Weyland from Prometheus mentions his mentor from the pyramid in the City of Angels, meaning this very pyramid. So it's no coincidence that Kirsch's hairstyle, played by Timothy Oliphant, resembles Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer. There's subtext everywhere.
Used to be food, you know.
Me.
Humanity.
In the end, the xenomorph escapes on Prodigy's private island, while the robo-girl Wendy somehow finds common ground with the aliens. Yes, they now make contact pretty easily beyond their default murder settings. The series once again repeats the now somewhat tired pop culture truth that the most terrifying and dangerous creatures in the universe are humans, and it will return with a second season where humanity will fight against out-of-control synthetics who have teamed up with the xenomorphs.
Now we rule.
Wait, what about Eyeball? Well, he's doing just fine. He found himself a human host and will soon show everyone who is the real threat. Alien Earth is beautifully stylized, especially when it comes to the resemblance between the Mazzino and the Nostromo ships. It talks about important philosophical themes, and overall it looks great. But it completely forgets about the xenomorphs and the role fans expect from them, and incoherent plot progression constantly forcing the characters to make the dumbest and most reckless decisions imaginable. It feels as if Noah Hawley just got so used to writing absurdly stupid characters in Fargo that he decided to bring the same idea into his new series. But here that approach simply cannot work. And the cold reception to the supposedly deep Alien Earth proves exactly that. Character stupidity used purely to move the plot forward is a bad screenwriting tool. Especially when you compare it to Alien Romulus, where the characters were supposed to be naive and foolish by design. Yet next to the cast of Earth, they still look like models of caution. We'll see what happens in Season 2. I'm not ready to give up even on a series like this set in the Alien universe. I just love this world too much. But this is not the end. Despite the very weak response to Alien Earth, the franchise actually has very good prospects. Fede Alvarez clearly understands the material and is already working on a follow-up to Romulus. And most importantly, the xenomorphs will officially be joined by the Predators. I think the most attentive viewers may have noticed that this video is missing the two films from the Alien vs. Predator series. But since those films contradict the main series in many ways and especially do not fit together with Ridley Scott prequels, I decided to talk about them separately in a video about all the Predator films. Because you simply can't discuss such a major crossover without properly introducing the other side of the conflict. After this Alien video, I'll release a full video about every Predator project. That sinister extraterrestrial hunters will definitely clash with the xenomorphs again, on the big screen. The next exciting video is already on the screen. Click it and keep watching. Thanks for your time. This is 11 Slate.